Welcome, friends. Today, our first presentation will be Gary Smith, and he's going to talk about a little bit about, you know what, Gary, I'll let you introduce yourself.
Oh, okay. Thank you. I'm Gary Smith, a member of Morristown Friends, and the committee asked me if I wanted to do a presentation this year talking about some of Friends' spiritual message. One of the things that always inspired me about Quakerism is reading some of the writings of the first Friends, the first generation of Quakers, like George Fox, Robert Barkley, William Penn. And this morning we'll read and we'll discuss some of the more notable quotes. And I think that when we read and reread these writings, it kind of puts us in touch with the spiritual roots of our faith, and can deepen both our spiritual community and our own inner spiritual lives. So, all right, well, let's get started then. For people who just joined us, Gary Smith, member of Morristown, and our presentation today, well, it's actually going to be more of a discussion. We're going to talk about some of the writings from the first generation of Quakers, and begin with George Fox. Quakerism was actually born of the experience of George Fox. He was from the north of England, and he grew up in a very Puritan family who was respected for their faith. The Puritans themselves came out of the English Reformation, which is when leading English theologians sought to purify or cleanse the church of ritual and worship that weren't based on biblical teaching. So instead, the Puritans stressed the teachings of the gospel and the salvation through God's grace. Fox's father was a very devout Puritan, and Fox himself grew up to be very serious in his demeanor and preoccupied with thoughts of religion. So in a little bit, we'll talk about the relations between Puritans and Quakerism. But as a young man in the 1640s, Fox left home and traveled throughout England. And he was really torn by questions about the relationship between himself, other people, and God. And he wasn't finding any answers in the established churches. And so he became what was called then a seeker. And he took to the road, kind of like on a journey of discovery. At that time, England was really in a state of turmoil. The king and parliament were in contention, and this led to the English Civil War, which was as much a religious war as a civil one. On one side was the king and the established authority of the Church of England, and on the other hand, Parliament, which was led by the Puritan leader Oliver Cromwell, and a parliamentarian army, which was for the most part Puritan. And England's social turmoil was mirrored with Fox's internal one. So he found no answers in the religious people to whom he spoke. And he didn't think he would ever find answers, and he became really despaired. And then one day he had a revelation that changed his life and led to him founding the Quaker movement. Josh, you want to pull up the first quote from Fox? So, as I had forsaken the priests, so I left the separate preachers also, and those esteemed the most experienced people. For I saw there was none among them that could speak to my condition. And when all my hopes in them and all men were gone, so that I had nothing outwardly to help me, nor could tell me what to do, then I heard a voice which said, there is one, Jesus Christ, that can speak to thy condition. And when I heard that, my heart leapt for joy. The Lord let me see why there was none on earth who could speak to my condition, namely, that I might give him all the glory. For we are all concluded in sin and shut up in unbelief, as I had been, that Christ might have preeminence, who enlightens, who gives grace and faith and power. Thus, when God doth work, who shall prevent it? And this I knew experimentally. So this experience turned Fox from a seeker to a finder. He found that God wanted him to teach others, that they didn't need to depend on human teachers or guides either, because each of them could experience God directly and hear his voice as he had. So when we read Fox's writing, I mean, he wrote about 400 some years ago, 450 years ago. And the way he writes, it's kind of very thick and dense to modern ear. It's almost like reading Shakespeare in the original. But what he's saying is that he couldn't hear the voice of God directly through all the noise that came from the people who claimed to speak for God. As Quakers, I think this is probably one of the key experiences we all share. So if anybody want to have a comment or a question about that. Okay. So Fox thought that Christ the light had come to teach people himself and to trust the light that was in all men and women. And the belief in an inner light within each person is based in part on a passage from Gospel of John. It says, that was the true light, which lighteth every man come into the world. So early friends took this verse as one of their mottos and often referred to themselves as children of the light. So Fox wanted to express his belief that if people would be silent and wait on God, then the light would teach them how to conduct their lives, teach them about the Christ within them, and show them the condition of their heart. And by knowing God by their inner light, they would rid themselves of the things that separate them from God. So from this epiphany in 1652, Fox engaged in a traveling ministry, preaching at the close of Puritan meetings or outdoors before crowds. And he encouraged his listeners to hear for the voice of Christ within themselves, and for they themselves to share in free ministry, the church. And he believed such an experience would encourage them to be honest in their business and day-to-day dealings and compassionate to the needy. So Fox's activities challenged the standing of the established churches, and he was imprisoned many times, as were his followers. But the persecution didn't stop him from preaching, and instead he used it to show his faithfulness. In 1652, Fox climbed up a desolate mountain called Pendle Hill and saw a vision of, quote, a people in white raiment come to the Lord, unquote. The vision signified to him that by proclaiming Christ's power, Fox would gather people into God's kingdom. And it did. By 1660, he had more than 50,000 followers. Very enthusiastic young men and women, who were called the Valiant 60, joined Fox in preaching, gathering crowds at fairs, marketplaces, in the fields, and sometimes even in jails and courts. And these missionaries were unusual in their time. Most other preaching was done by well-ordained male clergymen and well-educated, ordained male clergymen. But most of the Valiant 60 were just ordinary farmers and tradesmen, and some of them were women. Members of the Valiant 60 traveled not only throughout England, but also to the rest of Great Britain, Europe, and North America. One of them, Mary Fisher, went as far as Turkey and spoke to the Sultan about her beliefs and the need for peace between their two countries. Because the Valiant 60 came mostly from northern England, they were considered backward by educated London elite, and they were really looked down on. And by standing against the church structure in place Many of them suffered imprisonment or corporal punishment or both. But like as Fox did, several of them used their suffering to build on and give evidence of their faith. So we'll talk about James Naylor. One of the more notable of the Valiant 60 was James Naylor from Yorkshire. He was a veteran of Cromwell's army, and he experienced what he described as the voice of God calling him from work in his fields. So he gave up his possessions and he began seeking spiritual direction, which he found in Quakerism after meeting George Fox. Naylor became a prominent traveling Quaker evangelist, attracting many converts, and was considered a very skilled theological debater. And like Fox, he also experienced persecution. So here's how Naylor described his conversion and persecution. Josh, you want to call up the second quote for Naylor? There is a spirit which I feel delights to do no evil, nor to revenge any wrong, but it delights to endure all things, and hope to enjoy in the end its hope, and outlive all wrath and contention, and to weary out all exultation and cruelty, or whatever is of contrary nature to itself. It sees to the end of all temptations. As it bears no evil in itself, so it conceives none in thoughts to any other. If it be betrayed, it bears it, for its ground and spring is the mercies and forgiveness of God. Its crown is meekness, its life is everlasting love unfeigned. It takes its kingdom with entreaty and not with contention, and keeps it by lowliness of mind. In God alone it can rejoice, though none else regard it or can have its own life. So here Naylor says that he felt the call of the Spirit to willingly endure the suffering that he could preach God's words. And he really had the opportunity to experience this cruelty and offer the forgiveness that he describes. In 1656, he reenacted the Palm Sunday arrival of Christ in Jerusalem, riding into the city of Bristol, England on a donkey, as Jesus did into Jerusalem. So for this, Naylor was arrested, tried before Parliament for blasphemy, and found guilty. So Naylor was put in a pillory and had red hot iron bored through his tongue. He was branded with the letter B on his forehead and then imprisoned 2 years of hard labor. But he saw in this an opportunity to demonstrate his faith by standing up and willingly accepting it to preach. I don't know, there's a lot of people today who would take the risks of this type of punishment now to preach. So another, talk about Margaret Fell, another early preacher, Margaret Fell from Lancashire. Yeah, she was the wife of a local justice of the peace and member of Parliament. She met Fox in 1652 when he stayed at her home in Swarthmore Hall. She writes of the experience. Jack, you want to call up Margaret Fell's quote?
Yes.
So this is Margaret Fell describing meeting Fox. And so Fox spoke, that Christ was the light of the world, and lights every man that comes into the world, and by this light they may be gathered to God. I stood in my pew and wondered at his doctrine, for I'd never heard such before. And then he went on and opened the scriptures and said, the scriptures were the prophets' words, and Christ and the apostles' words, and what, as they spoke, they enjoyed and possessed, and had it come from the Lord. And then he added, then what had any to do with the scriptures, but as they came to the Spirit that gave them forth? You will say, Christ saith this, and the apostles say that, but what can thou say? Art thou a child of the light, and hast thou walked in the light? And what thou speakest, is it inwardly from God? And this opened me so that it cut me to the heart, and I clearly saw we were all wrong. So I sat down in my pew again and cried bitterly. I cried in my spirit to the Lord that we are all thieves, for we have taken the scriptures in words and know nothing of them in ourselves. So for Margaret, the great realization was that she had been taking the words of scriptures and using them without a true understanding of what those words meant. They were just words, they weren't a lived experience. And in Fox and the other early Quakers, she discovered people who were beginning to live out the words of the scripture and actually begin to live into the story of the Gospels and find their lives in that narrative. Just as the Spirit had inspired the prophets of the Old Testament and the apostles of the New, it still dwelt in everyone, and anybody could give it voice. So Margaret Fell and the other women preachers of the time showed that from the very start of the Quaker movement, ministry was not restricted to men. While some radical Puritan sects allowed women to preach, the conception of gender equality in Quakerism was unknown by most other groups at that time. And responding to criticisms of women's ministry, one Quaker woman, Sarah Blackborough, cited the Gospel of Paul, writing, Christ the power was one in the male and female, one spirit, one light, one life, and one power, which brings forth the same witness and ministers forth itself in the male and the female. Other people who are familiar with the Gospel of John recall that when the women went to the tomb following Christ's resurrection, they didn't find him there. Instead, they found the angel. The angel told them that Christ had risen and was gone, and then he charged them to go forth and to say what they had seen. So in some ways, you could say that actually the first women charged with spreading the gospel, or the first people charged with spreading the gospel were women. But we'll talk a little bit about silent worship. So early on, the Quaker movement adopted the practice of silent worship. This comes from Psalm 46:10. Be still and know that I am God. Now, friends began to pray in expectant waiting for divine inspiration. So Alexander Parker, an early Quaker from Lancashire, described it thus. Anyway, this is Alexander Parker writing in 1660. The first that enters the place of your meeting, turn in thy mind to the light, and wait upon God singly, as if none were present but the Lord, and here thou art strong. Then the next that comes in, let them in simplicity of heart sit down and turn into the same light, and wait in the Spirit, so that all the rest coming in the fear of the Lord, sit down in pure stillness and silence of all flesh, and wait in the light. Those who are brought to such a pure still waiting upon God in the Spirit are come nearer to the Lord than words are, for God is a spirit, and in the Spirit he is worshipped. In such a meeting, there will be an unwillingness to part asunder, to be ready to say in yourselves, it is good to be here, and this is the end of all words and writings, to bring people to the eternal living word. Now, Robert Barkley, who was a Scot Quaker, he described his first experience as silent worship, and something I always found moving. For when I came into the silent assemblies of God's people, I felt a secret power among them which touched my heart. And as I gave way into it, I found the evil weakening in me and the good raised up. So I became knit and united to them, hungering more and more after the increase of this power in life, whereby I might feel myself perfectly redeemed. Barclay had formal university theological training, but he had never had such a profound, moving experience. And coming together in silent worship, he found the opportunity to quiet his inner turmoil. and center down into silence. So by worshiping with other people of like mind, he found himself united with them in spirit. So Barkley also wrote, as many candles are lit and put into one place, do greatly augment the light and make it more to shine forth. So when many are gathered together in the same life, there is more of the glory of God, and his power appears to the refreshment of each individual, for that he partakes not only of light and life raised up in himself, but in all the rest. These the three quotes here from Parker and the two from Barclay, I always found very moving. Some people will talk about experiencing a gathered meeting. Other people come in and they talk about experiencing just a presence in Quaker meeting, and just a general refreshing and uplifting. It's sometimes it's more than words can describe, but if anybody wants to offer their experience.
Gary, I had a question.
Okay.
When referring to the candles, is that a kind of an early relation with candles and the inner light and candles and Quakerism?
Yes, so that each person, I guess he's using candles as a metaphor for the inner light in each person, so that when we come together in spirit, we bring our light together, the sum is greater than the total of its parts. So like Fox and Fell before him, he found personal spiritual experience outside of scripture. So Barclay went on to describe this in a book he wrote called The Apology, which was a detailed justification of Quakerism written in response to its critics. This is one that I always found inspiring too. We do distinguish between the certain knowledge of God and the uncertain, between the spiritual knowledge and the literal, the saving heart knowledge and the soaring, airy-headed knowledge. The last, we confess, may by different means be obtained, but the first by no other way than the inward, immediate manifestation and revelation of God's Spirit, shining in and upon the heart, enlightening the opening understanding. So Fox went on to say that a person's knowledge of God, which doesn't come from a personal revelation, is maybe of no more value than the chirping of a parrot who's been taught to say a few words. Or like describe the description of sunlight or colors to a blind man who, although he may be very smart in other things, you can't truly experience them. These things can only be known by those who have seen them and really felt a spiritual awakening through personal experience. So move on. The last person's writings I want to look at is William Penn. He was another early convert to Quakerism. And he was attracted to Quaker faith, in which he saw much of the spirit of the early church, where the Christians sought to follow the guidance of the Holy Spirit and create communities that model of Christian love. So one of Penn's most famous sayings is, "Let us try what love will do." Penn was one of the wealthiest and most influential men in England. He used his relationship with the king to establish Quaker colonies in New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and Delaware as places of refuge for persecuted Quakers. Penn's Quaker beliefs were expressed in the democratic principles he set forth in the Pennsylvania frame of government, which in turn was later to be an inspiration for the framers of the Constitution of the United States following the Revolution. But Penn also used his considerable writing skills to express his personal spiritual experiences, to nurture spiritual growth in others, and encourage them to do the same. So the couple quotes from Penn here. When you come to your meetings, what do? Do you then gather together bodily only and kindle a fire, compassing yourselves about with the sparks of your own kindling, and so please yourselves and walk in the light of your own fire, or in the sparks which you have kindled? Or rather, do you sit down in true silence, resting from your own will and workings, and waiting upon the Lord, with your minds fixed in that light where Christ has enlightened you, until the Lord breathes life in you, refreshes you, and prepares you in your spirits and your souls to make you fit for his service, that you may offer unto him a pure and spiritual sacrifice. So Penn's saying that faith wasn't just something for Sabbath, but was something that needed to be expressed in how the faithful people live, and using your spiritual experience to try to be a service to others. And he also talked too about, well, let's read the next quote. True godliness doesn't turn men out of the world, but enables them to better live in it, and excites their endeavors to mend it, not hide their candle under a bushel, but set it upon a candlestick. So here he's talking about using the spiritual experience that we could have in a Quaker meeting to inspire us to go out and spread the light. And Penn also saw that people of faith may not always speak the same language or have the same ideals, the same practices, but could still worship the same God. Here's a quote: "The humble, meek, merciful, just, pious, and devout souls are everywhere of one true religion, and when death has taken off the mask, they will know one another, though the different costumes they wear here on earth make them strangers." Now this kind of has like a foreshadowing of universalist ideas that were to come into Quakerism and other Protestant faiths that maybe John Woolman expressed like a century later. What he's saying is that I guess nobody has a monopoly, and although our experience may bring us into a Quaker meeting, other people's experience may take them a different route, but in the end, we can all arrive at the same destination. We'll wrap it up. So we're focused today on the writings of the first generation of Friends, men and women who felt a legacy still felt today. And their writings stress the theme of the individual experience. And that emphasis continues today. Quaker worship isn't an occasion to learn a preformed creed or dogma. It's not spoon-fed. Rather, when we come together in worship, we create conditions for each of us to experience our own inner light. And from a personal level, there's been a few occasions, both in and out of Quaker meeting, when I've had like some really deep, heartfelt, moving spiritual experiences. I'm not sure this is the best form to describe these, but maybe I can tell you what such an experience feels like. Josh, you want to grab that last picture? Sometimes my friend Sharon and I will go to the beach before dawn, and we'll stand on the shore and we'll watch the sky until we see the first light rising above the water. And to see the sun reflecting into the brilliant colors and the clouds, and its reflection shimmering on the waves as darkness turns to light, it can really take my breath away. Just seeing that the victory of light over darkness, the promise of a new day, is very moving. And we've taken a few pictures of these sunrises, and some of them have come out pretty well. We print them and hang them in the house, and it helps me recall like the memories of the time that they were taken. These are good memories. But in the end, these are only pictures. It's only an image of the event. It's not the actual sunrise. So it cannot recreate that same sense of wonder as seeing the actual sunrise. There's just no real substitute for the real experience. So I would just wrap up by saying I would encourage everyone, like Fox, to seek that inner spiritual experience. And conveniently enough, he founded a faith community which allows us to do it. So again, thank you for Tricorder Committee for allowing me to speak. All the quotes we've discussed are in the back of Faith and Practice, published, the recent one published by Philadelphia Yearly Meeting. And biographies of these writers can be found in libraries of your local meeting house, or just going online and typing in their names. So thank you again for your time this morning.
Thank you very much, Gary.
Gary, please don't go. This
I
is
will.
Rose.
Yeah.
Thank you for that beautiful presentation. The quotes that you shared were just exquisite and gave such a concise journey through early friends' experiences. And your last sharing and the beautiful photo made me think about Fox's story of the ocean of light and the ocean of darkness. Now, maybe you or Martin or someone else can exactly quote it. But as I recall, in one of his meditations, Fox felt that God was showing him a great deal of evil and how it felt to be someone who was being violent and evil. And he started to shudder and said, why is God showing me this, since I'm not going to be that kind of person? And then he had the vision of this ocean of darkness and felt he was being sucked down into it. And then he saw the ocean of light and floated into that. I've always found that to be one of the central teachings of Quakerism. Can you comment on that?
I'm not that familiar with that writing, but it sounds interesting.
Why
Martin,
don't we throw that that comment out to the group and see if anyone has some more comparisons between that imagery. So so one friend asked a question asking how contemporary friends relate to phrases like that of God in everyone and that of God in all things. Might there significant context application one over the other? Might there be spiritual value when naming God of all things? So I think the question is, how does that kind of phrasing relate? What does that kind of phrasing mean to friends today and friends and early friends? Has the meaning changed at all?
well, I guess my take is that over the last few centuries, the awareness, the spiritual awareness, both in our community and in our society at large, seems to have grown. At first, the first generation of Quakers, being products of their time, they could accept that there was that of God in all people, but may not have also associated that in nature or in different types of people. But as time's gone on, we've, our spiritual awareness may have been raised so that now somebody may not look like us, they may not speak the same language as us, they may not behave like us, but we can still accept them as having that of God within them. And then we could look at our fellow travelers on the earth, the animals, the plants, and perhaps the spirit dwells within them as all. I'm just kind of speaking off the cuff here for myself, but
I know that when I first came to Woodbury meeting, there were certain key passages and certain key beliefs and testimonies that were discussed. And from the very first day, it was like a rocket went off inside me because I connected so closely with it. And I had never felt that anywhere else, any other church, or the only place I'd felt that kind of spiritual connection was when I was working in the garden or looking at the stars. So especially the idea of there's that of God in everyone. I had come from a background of special education, and I was working often with the very severely handicapped. And if you're working with that group, you have to have that belief inside that everyone has a spirit and everyone has a value and contributes to the world. And I definitely like the synergistic effect. And one person, even a severely profoundly handicapped person, can touch the hearts of many. So the light within, and especially when I take the idea of we're all connected in this world. I came to the meeting with that belief, and to me, it makes perfect sense that we're all connected, because when science says energy is neither created nor destroyed. So I think we're all interconnected elementally. And so I love the fact that we are, especially in the present time, now connecting to the animals and even the plants, and realizing that we are not the center of the world. We are part of the world and we share it with the others. So our stewardship needs to encompass all creatures. And I feel like that's especially important right now, where we're facing the climate change and it's doing havoc with our world. And we need to enact some, personal and community efforts to stop the drastic changes that are happening as we speak. We don't have a lot of time left, so we better hurry up and get on the ball and start doing things that are significant. So I won't go into all the climate change details, but we all know that, Earth has been hotter than it has been, and it's causing bigger storms and creating droughts in the ocean. It's affecting so many things that if we don't turn it around in the next 10 years or so, we may not have a livable world. So anyway, the teachings and Testimonies of Quakerism, very first day I walked in, just lit up in my heart because I identified with them. They were the core beliefs that I had developed in my life. So anyway, I don't know how to end.
I think Carolyn wants to speak.
Yes, I just finished reading a good book called The Eternal Christ by Richard Rohr. And he is a Franciscan monk, but speaks to this inclusion of the Christ consciousness in not only people, but the whole world around us. And I think it opens up a lot of thought and a lot of looks at the way Christianity has unfortunately dealt more on heaven and hell than on living day by day and working with our world. I'd strongly urge, if you're interested in that kind of thing, that it's well worth opening us up to not only Quakerism, but the wider world, not only of Christianity, but of all belief systems.
That brings up an interesting point. One major difference between Quakerism and others is we don't do iconography really. Like everyone knows the general thought idea of what God looks like, but Quakers really don't have a picture of God. How do you guys think that influenced or was influenced by early Quaker writings, and how that influenced how Quakerism continued to develop? Because we don't quite have the same, like, God as a white bearded guy that other depictions seem to have, or one thing I've always also noticed is there's not really the same focus on the devil. I don't think the devil really comes up in Quakers. So, anyone have thoughts on that?
I think we tend to be very open in most regards. In fact, we don't, it's a little bit contested. Some people believe it and some people don't, but many believe that you don't even technically have to be a Christian to be a Quaker. Because we've had people who have Buddhist backgrounds and variety of other religions, and they still consider themselves Quakers. So I think I find that interesting that we could have core beliefs that translate to all people, even if from different backgrounds. So I don't really, personally, I don't think would really matter what God looked like. So, and surely if someone can create everything, they could make themselves look like whatever. So,
also, I wonder what we do about people who do really horrific, terrible, unimaginable things. How do we deal with that? I mean, you can use the words, I see that of God in that person, that person's a child of God. But then how do you go further with that to really use your beliefs to interact with that person or consider that person?
I found the George Fox quote about the oceans of light and darkness, Karen, and it speaks directly to what you were saying. I went back into Nottinghamshire, and there the Lord showed me that the natures of those things which were hateful without were within, in the hearts and minds of wicked men. The natures of dogs, swine, vipers, of Sodom and Egypt, Pharaoh, Cain, Ishmael, Esau, etc. The natures of these I saw within, though people had been looking without. I cried to the Lord, saying, why should I be thus seeing? I was never addicted to commit these evils. And the Lord answered, it was needful that I should have a sense of all conditions. How else should I speak to all conditions? And in this I saw the infinite love of God. I saw also that there was an ocean of darkness and death, but an infinite ocean of light and love, which flowed over the ocean of darkness. So he's saying that in order to speak to people who have done unspeakable evils, we have to have compassion and understand that the same impulses are within us.
And how many of us every day go forward with that in mind? Or especially in these times.
It's difficult, but we have to go from a place of compassion, and compassion doesn't mean just lay down and let anyone do anything.
Right.
Compassion, it's something, of course, I've put thought into, but you can have compassion for the victims of the person, but you can also try to encourage the person to be better, because you don't want it to be where someone tries to be a better person, but they are told, oh no, you committed too much evil to ever become better, because that doesn't help anyone. One thing that's always inspired me about the Quaker commitment to pacifism is it doesn't mean like laying down or accepting injustice. It just means fighting it as best as possible. And it comes up in weird places. Like I was reading a biography of George Takei, and he mentioned a Quaker who would get shot at, but risk that in order to bring books to internment camps. So Quakers who refuse to accept injustice, but also refuse to commit injustice, to let others' injustice drive them to injustice. So a sort of strong compassion that the inner light compels you. Because it's easy to be upset with what the cruelty of others and to let it hinge into a desire for vengeance, but it must be compassion that drives us to our action. It must be compassion that drives us to justice, if that makes sense.
I wanted to share that for me, the scientific, again, speaks to me. And when you talk about the DNA in creatures and plants, and we share so much DNA, so it's not hard for me to believe that there is that of God in everyone. So even when people say, well, how can you believe Hitler had that of God in him? And I said, well, maybe the majority of his behavior was not from that of God, but I do believe he had the light within. He just didn't have it cranked up very high. So that makes sense to me, because I'm a very scientifically based person, and I can see that the DNA is like, we all share so much, and we all have the basic elements of the light within us. I'm not sure exactly where the light shines, or to me, it's in my heart and my brain, but everything's connected. You know, the more you learn about the body, the more you learn about the science and how much crossover there is between species. To me, it's apparent that there is that of God in everyone. And that means there's hope, because that means that no matter how bad a person is, you can reach them at some level at least. not that I want all the criminals to be let out of prison, but I just want them to be treated humanely and fostered to be the best person they can be. And that person may need to stay in a sheltered environment, but at least their goodness can come out, and they can hopefully do goodness even from prison.
I've been thinking a little bit of the allegory of the cave and how it relates to Gary's pictures of the sunset versus experiencing them in real life. And then with some of the quotes that he mentioned, how people realized that they were essentially paying lip service and had these spiritual revelations that made them do something like that, often risked their lives and was, monumental things that kind of changed the world. And like trying to figure out what makes us do those kinds of things. Like what is it about those spiritual changes that makes us want to risk everything to spread God's message? Like what makes us decide to go outside the cave, to look at a sunset rather than take a picture or look at a picture of one? Like what is that catalyst?
I think a core principle of the cave, I forget the name of it. It's a famous story, but I think a core principle of it is, and it kind of relates to the modern movie, the Matrix series and stuff, is that once you learn something that completely reshapes your worldview, even if there are elements of it that are negative. In this case, it would be, risking being, branded and having stakes driven through you for early Quaker sense. Fortunately, we're better now. But I think a core element is that when your worldview changes so drastically from what everyone else sees, you need to share that, or else you kind of go crazy a little bit. You can't go back to being like that.
I never thought to connect the allegory of the cave with Quaker beliefs, Josh, but I'm seeing such a connection because Plato, who told that story 2,500 or so years ago, was trying to get people to realize that there were ultimate virtues, that there were first principles that were sublime, whether that was about the good, the beautiful, the true, but that all we perceive are mere reflections of those realities. And that is in some ways similar to the indescribable insights that we sometimes get in worship. It's not possible to put into words how profound a feeling may be. And that's a foundational mystical experience which Quakers sometimes feel in worship.
It kind of makes me wonder how many more cave-like revelations are out there in terms of, the future of humanity. And it also makes me wonder how many of those supposed revelations are kind of cyclical, in the sense it's things that people once knew or understood in a certain realm that we've kind of lost, and we'll end up circling back around. if you know what I mean.
What I've wondered now is if people are no longer, well, at least in this country, they're no longer arrested for expressing their religious ideas or whipped or branded. But there's a much more subtle cruelty, wisecrack, ridicule, the cynicism that I think stops people in the community at large from having discussions like we're having this morning. Or a sense that, two things we shouldn't talk about, religion or politics. Well, we actually do talk a lot about politics, but not often fruitfully. And maybe we don't talk about religion because we're out of practice. So maybe these are things that we shouldn't avoid talking about, but learn how to discuss, to share ideas. It just seems that the only times you hear people discuss matters of faith in the public forum, they're using it as a billy club to beat up people who disagree with them on not on matters of faith, but on matters of policy. So that whereas, like, James Naylor, he's charged with blasphemy and imprisoned and beaten. Now you would just get a lot of nasty comments on Facebook for expressing your faith.
Perhaps it's more a need of listening at deeper levels and asking open questions that allow the other person to explain themselves, to look inside for answers to those open-ended questions, and thinking of opening their minds and hearts to other possibilities. I just think more than what has been called proselytizing, it's important. I think so many people are not listened to, but then they grab onto something that kind of anchors them in a way that's not positive.
An example that comes to me from another culture, when someone commits a transgression against community beliefs, they are brought before everyone, and individuals express all of the love and beauty that they have seen in that person, their experiences with. And this may take hours and it may take days, but they are infused with all of the love and the potential that is seen, which helps to create that place of how their gifts can then be absorbed into community toward a meaningful life, a spiritual life. And it helps ground the individual from any temptations of evil against the community. It sounds simple. I don't know how that concept might be applied to the system of transgressions here in the US, where we have imprisonments, where people are further demeaned and not having easy paths or truthful paths, I would call them, so that they can come out and be loved. It seems that when people come out of prisons, we have a system that continues to shame individuals. And so our prison ministry used to be, I think, stronger than what I believe it might be today. I don't hear of the application of Quakers prison ministry today as much as I did perhaps 20, 30 years ago. And I don't know if that's shared from others' experiences, that it has diminished. But I think there is something to be said of that system. I've traveled halfway around the world to an island nation called Palau. And in their prisons, most often individuals are there because they have harmed a bird with a slingshot. That is very much against their beliefs. And since it's an island chain and you live off island, you need to go to the one island where there is a prison. The prison doesn't have any walls, and your meals are provided by your own family off island. So your own family is then needing to provide your comfort and need. So you're taking away from your own family and community to have them come and be with you to create just the basics and essentials and to pray with you. And that's how it happens. And they usually do not have the recidivism that we find here in this country. And so some people believe you can measure a country or community's strengths by their prison systems. There's something correlative about that. Maybe that can help provide fuel for thought.
It has become more difficult to do prison ministry in the past several years, maybe the past 20 years. Medford Meeting used to have a wonderful program, the Storybook Project, where they bought 2 copies of a children's book and gave one to a child who had a parent in prison and the other to the person who was in prison. And they could read the same story and have a telephone call and talk about it. And that was lovely. But then there was a change of administration in the prison and the project was no longer permitted. The same thing happened to the Garden Project at Newton Meeting in Camden. And Michelle Tarter has had difficulty with her ministry to women prisoners in northern New Jersey. And now I understand that prison is going to be closed. So it's become difficult, and yet Quakers do still outreach to people who are in prison. Westfield Meeting has a member who is a lifer. He murdered someone when he was a teenager on drugs and has had a tremendous change of character and increase in his educational level while he's in prison. He is able occasionally to Zoom or FaceTime with a small group of Westfield members and writes to them. And everyone considers him a full member, which is wonderful and can't happen very often, but it's an example of prison ministry.
I feel like some of those things are really good examples of one of the quotes that Gary shared with us about turning outward rather than inward. I feel like there is a tendency, even within our Quaker community, to adopt a siege mentality, to try to keep the negative things out of our community, of our lives. And it feels to me like it is an ongoing mistake. I feel like putting up those walls is one of the things that causes communities to fail.
Keep thinking, oh, sorry.
Okay.
I keep thinking about, I think it was the last William Penn quote slide. And it was the one where he was talking about, don't hide your light under a bushel or a candle under a bushel, that one. And Gary, you might be able to answer this, but I know the printing press was invented, I can't remember the exact date, I think it was 1600s. And I was wondering if the early Quakers utilized printed text, or if they were mainly preaching and writing in person. And obviously we have far more greater methods of communication now. So I was just wondering that.
I think the printing press was invented sometime around the late 1400s, and was actually could have been the catalyst for the whole Protestant Reformation. Because prior to that, Bibles had to be written by hand by monks who devoted their lives to it. So they were few and rare. Most people were not literate. So the Catholic priesthood would decide amongst themselves what to read from the Bible, and that was the message that they spread. But the printing press was invented in Germany, and as more people had access to the Bible and began to read it for themselves, they found a disconnect between what they were reading and what the Catholic Church was saying. And so of course you had Martin Luther and the whole Protestant Reformation. The first English Bible, I think, was written in printed in the English language in 1500 something by George Wycliffe, and I believe he was murdered by the Catholic Church because they saw a threat to their monopoly. But they couldn't stop it, and as more and more Bibles got printed, different translations, some dissident English ministers printed the Geneva Bible, which was the most widely read English Bible for some time. And then, but to get to your point, yes, early Quakers made wide use of printing pamphlets and books. Robert Barkley, whose quotes we read, he was probably the best known of the Quaker writers of that period. He was one of the best educated. He was able to translate Fox and the other early Quakers' ideas into coherent statements in an attempt to be better understood by the English government and the persecution. And later, when they were emigrating, they also made wide use of printed books to advertise the opportunities for life in the New World. There's a Quaker it's called Quaker Writings homepage. It's available online. I mean, I remember looking it up 25 years ago. It's maintained by a guy named Pete Sipple, but he has a lot of writings from the mid 1600s up to the 1890s. And this is all works that had been published. A lot of it's out of print now. A lot of it's just the actual material has been long gone, but the references to it cite enough of it that they can reproduce it. If anybody has time to kill and you're surfing the web, you might want to check it out.
What is that title again?
The Quaker Writings homepage, by Pete Sippel, Sippel. One of the things I've missed about the COVID shutting down in-person meetings is having the opportunity to have discussions like this. When I first started going to Friends meeting in Haddonfield, there was a guy named Harold Heritage who Ruth and Rose may remember. Harold encouraged me to participate in a study group, and following meeting for worship, a half dozen of us would gather in the meeting house library, and we would read from Faith and Practice. Sometimes we would read from the sections on community or how the meetings are organized, but a lot of times we would do exactly what we've done this morning. We would pick out one or two quotes and read it, reread it, and discuss it. And I always felt that that was a key part of my introduction to Quakerism and a big part of my foundation, my faith.
It was Mona Darnell who encouraged me to begin studying Quakerism and pressed me to enroll in the Quaker Studies program in 1981. And she was also a longtime Haddonfield member. It's amazing how an elder's advice can lead us into an amazing spiritual journey. And Harold was a beautiful soul.
I miss him every day.
Share the message of "This Little Light of Mine, I'm Gonna Let It Shine" song. I think that is so powerful. And even as a young person, a teenager, when I was troubled or when I felt the need to reach out to the spirits or to God, I would sit in a room, turn all the lights off, and put one candle on the floor, and I would sit or lie next to it. And it seemed that it was a way I could really reach inside and could feel God's presence. So it's always been a symbol of mine personally. So when I came to Quakerism and found out this little light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine, it was just a total match. And so I find the light is helpful for me when I need it personally, but it absolutely gets stronger every time you add another light. And so that's the synergistic effect again. And we have to always be shining our light and reaching out and doing things in the world, rather than just, like Joshua was saying, rather than just barricading ourselves. Because I used to get really upset when I would think, oh my gosh, there's just so much bad stuff happening in the world. How in the world can a few good people make a difference? And then actually when I came to Quaker meeting, that's when I learned, and I started thinking about how many individuals have made huge differences in the world and the ripple effect. So it gave me hope. And so I, just even if it's a few individuals doing things, there are ripple effects. So I love that song. From singing it.
My name is Marion Jones, and I'm from the, well, I started attending the Quaker meetings or at the Newton House. And a lot of what you're saying and your experience does resonate with me and my feelings and experiences. And I'm really feeling the Holy Spirit, you know. I didn't want to speak because I didn't want to start crying or anything, but I have been on a spiritual journey for many years. I was raised as a Catholic. My grandfather, in fact, helped build the African American Catholic Church in Camden, St. Bartholomew's on Kane Avenue. And so I have a spiritual history there, and I attend often. I have had many experiences, I would say, feeling the presence of the Lord and having him speak to me, but I can't say that they are words. I don't know what it is. It's some feeling that overwhelms me. And I tried to share that with a priest that I was, well, actually two that I was very close to. And I felt overjoyed that I could share this feeling with them and how it was, you know, comforting to me. And they made me feel like I was crazy. You know, it's like, don't tell anyone about this ever. And both of them more or less said the same thing. So I don't often share it, but I found that that is real. I mean, I always knew it was real. I didn't say, oh, well, because I'm Catholic, I'm not supposed to feel that. It didn't matter to me because I felt that it came from God or from this spiritual entity, and it is the light. And Gary, when you mentioned about the sunrise, it is so, I go out, I live in Camden, in the Parkside community, and Farnham Park is right across the street, more or less, from me and around the corner. And I go there often to see the sunrise over Cooper's Creek. And it is so overwhelming. I take pictures of it sometimes to, you know, get that feeling again. And also, you know, go out there with my dog. And I've found other people that do the same. But anyway, I just want to thank you for kind of, not that my feelings weren't credible, it's just that other people aren't afraid to speak about that and know that there's that feeling. And I do know there is darkness. I don't know about it, but I have been through darkness as well. But the light is so redeeming and so powerful. And that's all I want to say right now. Thank you.
Thanks, Marion. Thanks for joining.
You know, I want to thank you for saying that to me, because it legitimizes for me some things that I experienced.
Thank you, Gary, for being here for us again. Let's all thank Gary.
Thank you, Gary.
Gary.
Welcome. Thank you all for
And thank
listening.
you, everyone who came to join us. I found our talks, this was really an inspirational and fulfilling experience.